Well, good morning. Welcome to our first edition of the Ryan Report in the month of March. You know, the calendar says that spring is less than 3 weeks away, but the calendar has been about as reliable as the groundhog when it comes to forecasting when that season will actually arrive. This morning, we're going to talk about history, though, and it starts right now.
From TV6, this is the Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
So today we're going to talk about UP history with someone who probably knows more about that subject than anyone. Dr. Russell Minyagi is a professor emeritus at Northern Michigan University, where he retired from teaching in 2014. He continues to serve as the university historian and is associated with the Center for UP Studies. He's written extensively, and we will talk about some of his books this morning. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Russell Minyagi back to the Ryan Report. Nice to have you with us again.
Hey, thank you.
Let's give people a little bit of your history. I know we did that once before, but we probably have some new viewers with us. You actually grew up in California.
San Francisco, and studied there, and then eventually migrated to St. Louis University, got me into the Midwest to do my graduate work. And then in the middle of January 1968, took a trip up to the Upper Peninsula with a friend. And I wanted to see the Midwest before I went back to California.
Okay.
And then eventually applied for a job up here and got it in the fall of '69. And 45 years later, I retired.
The rest is history, as they say.
Yep.
What attracted you to the UP, do you think?
I think it was just the landscape. In retrospect, the hills, the trees, the water, the sunrises, for instance, just very unique environment that I enjoyed.
So you came here as a history professor, but you really developed a strong interest in the local history, didn't you?
Well, when I came up, I was my focus was the Spanish borderlands.
Okay.
And Latin American history. And then a good friend of mine, Bob Archibald, we were talking about it one day. He said, you know, you ought to focus on the local area. And I had always been interested in local history, regional history. And so it wasn't much of a change from one to the other, except I had to then study.
Right.
And learn, because if you grow up here, you take a trip to Mackinac, your parents take you here or there or something, you know of these places.
Right.
I had to do a quick study.
You had to learn.
Yeah.
You've written, I don't know, at least a dozen books on UP history. That has to take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of research, because you have to be accurate, right? Correct.
And I enjoy doing it, and that's a big thing. So it's not a chore. And the process is educational. You're constantly learning new things. And you think you have the history of the Upper Peninsula down, I have all the details down, and then all of a sudden something pops up, like we were talking earlier on the trail, the Carp River Trail,
right.
Which I've never seen anything written about. And then I dug into it and found this whole story about a winter trail out of Marquette.
A way to escape from Marquette in the cold winter months.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
I think one of your first books, you've spent a lot of time dealing with a lot of things. In fact, you've written a book about the entire history of the UP. But a number of your books focus on certain ethnic groups. And I think one of your first was about the Italians. Is that correct?
I did back in 1983, I did a study of the different Italian communities, which are scattered across the UP, and I did interviews. I ended up with 150 interviews, which today, because of the computerized digital world, are all online. And so you can listen to those interviews at will. Okay. Off your computer.
And what did you learn about the Italians in the UP in the early years?
Well, the thing was that they were attracted, number one, by mining. That was the big thing. And they basically brought, well, as they would, they brought their culture. So many of the things that I grew up with in San Francisco, like eating polenta, which is now kind of a high cuisine food, back then it was kind of a peasant's food, you know. And you didn't have anything else. You ate, cornmeal. And I all of a sudden found, oh, which would make sense. All the people up here were from northern Italy, where my family was from, and they all ate one of the things, polenta. So there were all these similarities, even though we were separated by 2,000 miles, between San Francisco and here.
I said you probably could have written a book and called it From Pasties to Cudighi, since the Cudighi, of course, came with the Italians, at least some Italians.
Correct, correct.
And the pasty came with the Cornish, and you also wrote about them, and they also were attracted by the mining, right?
Correct. They were the ultimate miners. Their Cornwall was a location of tin, and going back into the almost prehistoric period, and even the Cornish flag is white and black. And St. Piran, who introduced Christianity to Cornwall, had built a fire in some kind of a little cave, and it melted the tin, and it formed a cross. And so the Cornish flag is a white cross on a black background.
Okay. I quoted a line from your book. I don't remember exactly but it referred to Cornish coming because of the mining experience, Methodist churches, singing groups, cricket, and of course the pasty.
Correct.
So they brought all of those things to the Upper Peninsula.
Right, right.
We'll come back and talk about some other things, some other books you've written after we take a break. Back with more in just 2 minutes from now. We're talking this morning with Dr. Russell Minyagi, historian and author. You have a project going now, not necessarily a book, to make sure people know about someone unique in the Upper Peninsula. And I've said many times, Marquette pays tributes to a lot of their pioneers by putting their names on buildings and parks and things, and Peter White Library and Harlow Park, and it goes on and on. But one of those people is George Shiras, and you found that not many people really know who he was, right?
Well, that was kind of a surprise to me. George Shiras III was basically a pioneer wildlife photographer, and is now getting a lot of recognition in the state, nationally, internationally. And George Shiras, so we came up with the idea, my wife, Diane Kordich, and I, and she's doing a lot of the gut work on it, we're putting together a state marker, which will be down at the Shiras Park, and we got that renamed. It used to be called Picnic Rocks.
Right.
And the city went back to the original name, Shiras Park. The interesting, so we're going to have the marker's going to be down there explaining his life and so on. But he was involved in night photography. They had tripwires, and the deer and the porcupines and whatever would trip the wire, and he would get a photograph of them. And he then published this. He was a good friend of President Theodore Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt, as a matter of fact, came for the trial in 1913, he stayed at Shiras's home on Ridge Street. And Roosevelt told him, he was the big environmental president, said you ought to do a book on this. Well, Roosevelt passed away, and eventually Shiras did. So there's 2 volumes that the National Geographic Society published on how he did this photography and so on. But the other interesting thing about it is, about the park, is that it's on the North Country Trail, which is administered by the National Park Service. And Shiras also played a role in the development of a number of national parks and some animals in the parks, which he studied. And he was also influential in getting the Migratory Bird Act started, and it eventually passed in Congress.
He was a member of Congress for, I think, 1 term.
And he was there for one term, correct.
Okay. One thing that people should understand, of course, is this is almost in the prehistoric days when it comes to photography. And with what we have today with trail cams and cameras on our phone, I mean, this was really back in a different era, wasn't it?
Well, you had these large boxed cameras and so on, and he was taking pictures from a little larger boat, a little larger than a canoe, and he would take some of the pictures from the boat, with a flash, and then he would also have tripwires, the camera set up in the woods, and then the animals would come and trip the wire, and so you get these surprise look from deer and so on as they get hit with this massive explosion.
I think I remember, seeing a picture of him with a flashlight and a camera on a boat.
Correct.
And
Yeah, he did
that was the equivalent of his lighting in those days.
Yeah.
But I think, in doing a little research on my own, that he published in the National Geographic in like 1906, and
Correct.
that kind of brought him a lot of attention at that time.
That was the first time that was published. The first photographs came out in 1906. And at the time, two members of the board of the National Geographic Society resigned because they said, you're just getting into general photographs here, and you're not focusing on science and so on. And we lived to see a whole change in that attitude.
And he was not a native, but became interested in the area when he was a child, I guess.
Well, he came up originally. He and his dad brought him up as on summer trips, and they would come up to Marquette and fish, and then he hunted. And then at one point, he began questioning the whole process of hunting and what's going to happen to the deer and so on, and then turned to photography.
Turned from a gun to a camera, as I understand.
Correct. And then he was also influential in the state promoting, having good deer herds and so on, so the hunters would have something to hunt, and got some laws passed about carrying guns when you weren't supposed to in the woods and so on.
And I understand he married Peter White's daughter.
Correct.
So
Correct.
he does have a strong local connection.
Yeah.
So if people see the Shiras Planetarium or go to Shiras Park or drive through Shiras Hills, that name should have some meaning for them now, hopefully.
Correct.
And what do you think is accounting for his renaissance today? Hard to say?
It's hard to say. I know there was a program on television, not connected to the UP or anything, that talked about Shiras, the pioneer of why. He's just kind of been rediscovered by people beyond Marquette.
Okay. So he is a jewel from the UP. Interesting. Good luck with your project.
Okay.
We'll talk about some more of your writings and some more of your thoughts after we take one more break. Back with more on the Ryan Report just 2 minutes from now. Again, this morning we're talking with Dr. Russell Minyagi. Let's talk about some things going on right now. I understand that you're working on a book about apples. That sounds kind of fascinating.
Okay.
What's that about?
It was an idea that I had for a long time, because I'd read about the French bringing apples and pears into St. Ignace and so on. And then I had, in my last class, I had a fellow came up to me and he said, just in casual conversation, I grow apples and whatnot. David Smith from Northern Illinois, and so the two of us then have been working on this book dealing with apple culture in the Upper Peninsula and neighboring Wisconsin.
Okay.
And so we trace the story from the time of the French and then on up pretty much to the up to the present.
Where do apples stand today in the history of the UP?
Part of the problem is that you have to spend a great deal of time and money spraying and maintaining the apple orchards, and a lot of people didn't do that, and then were disappointed when they didn't make any money on their apples. And now there's a Jim Barron down in Rock who has 400 apple trees,
Okay.
and he is the largest apple producer in the Upper Peninsula today.
We'll be waiting to see when that new book comes out.
Yep.
You're also dealing, we hear a lot today about opiates, and you're dealing with a book, you're working on a book on that regarding the Upper Peninsula. I understand what it's about, but what are you trying to describe to people in that book?
Well, and I'm talking from my own experience, I never really, you don't come across a lot of state histories that talk about drugs, opiates, and so on. And I kind of ran across it in some newspaper articles and then pursued it, and found that problems with opiates go back to into the 19th century. Concerns for opium and all of the hard drugs that they talk about, cocaine and heroin and morphine, opium, and so on, have been an ongoing problem. And what I found was that opium, for instance, would be from China to Vancouver, then by train to Sault Ste. Marie, and then it entered the Midwest from Sault Ste. Marie like a rain of opium down through, you know, all the major cities.
Really?
And it was a topic that, as I get into it, doctors and so on all throughout the state and the area would get addicted to opium, and there were all the things you hear about today were going on 100 years ago.
Okay. Another subject, I know the Beaumier Center at NMU has a new presentation called From Chalk to Lightboards, Technology at NMU. And I understand in some ways they have you to thank for having some of that old technology available.
Well, as university historian and just interested in local history, whenever something surfaces like old computers, as happened in the 90s when they were dismantling West Hall for renovations, they had all these computers piled up there. And so I would go out looking for stuff, and I asked them, I said, what's going on? Oh, we're going to throw these out. So we saved, you know, one copy of each, and they've been in the Beaumier Heritage warehouse, and Dan Truckee was able to put them all together into a exhibit.
As a retired teacher, have you thought about the possibility of writing about all the changes that have occurred for education in our country?
Well, that would be, that's sort of a recent topic, but it becomes historic, and I find it very interesting that I'm sort of, you know, I interview people and so on, but all of a sudden I've been interviewed, and that whole history of the computer I was, you know, part of, where you didn't have them, and how do you get information. And in today's world, it's simple. You get on your computer, you can use newspaper indexes and well, like the information on the apples, on the opiates and so on. A lot of that came from just my computer in my office at home, reading the old newspapers.
It's made your work a lot easier.
Absolutely.
Okay. We've run out of time. Thanks for coming in this morning and talking with us about some UP history. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
I'll be back with some other silly thoughts for you in just a couple of minutes. You've probably heard the statement that we only use a small part of our brain and it actually has much greater capacity. Well, I really question that idea and believe our brain, at least the part that stores information, is really very limited. I've compared it to the hard drive on a computer. And like the computer, when the hard drive is full, it cannot accept any additional information. My theory is not based on medical science, but the following evidence. Have you ever found yourself walking somewhere in your house or at work and suddenly stopped to ask yourself, where am I going? You left your chair a few moments ago with a specific mission in mind, and before you got there, you forgot where you were going and why. There are also times, for example, when I've made a special trip downstairs to get something from the freezer, got distracted, and returned to where I started without the item I went to get in the first place. For me, the reason is simple. My hard drive is full. As we get older, our brain gets filled with so much useless information, we don't have room for anything new. It's also the reason we can't remember something our spouse told us just moments ago. I started thinking about this the other day when I was sitting quietly at home and found myself humming the opening song, the theme song, from a show I used to play each week when I was working at the radio station as a teenager. Now, believe it or not, there was a recorded radio show we would play each week where this man would read the comic strips from the Sunday paper. Today, it's hard to believe there would be such a show, but even harder for me to believe is the fact I still remember the opening theme song. The host of the show would sing it, and I'll spare you that part, but it went like this. I'm the Comic Weekly Man, the Jolly Comic Weekly Man, and I'm here to read the funnies to you, happy boys and honeys. For I'm the Comic Weekly Man, the Jolly Comic Weekly Man. So, I can't remember to buy milk at the grocery store, but this has been stuck in my memory for over a half-century. And while I was in this reflective mood, my mind flashed back to a commercial in radio from that same era. You may remember there were some Clark gas stations in the Upper Peninsula, including one in downtown Marquette. So when I was working at WDMJ Radio, I would often play their commercial. That jingle is still locked in my memory. I won't sing it for you now. So for me, there aren't just a couple of jingles bouncing around in my brain. There's so much other useless information, including a lot of songs I played as a young DJ back in the middle of the last century. The problem is, and this is where we're different than a computer, there's no way to get rid of that old useless information. If you say, I'm going to forget those old memories, all you've done is remind yourself once again they're still there. We all have our own memories, and many of them we want to be able to recall. But I have a hunch that each of us also have a lot of useless information up there that's taking up room on our personal hard drive that sometimes makes it difficult to remember just where we're going and why we want to go there. I'll be back in a minute. Time for us to wrap it up for another week. Remember to keep Upper Michigan Source and my uppermichigansource.com in mind for the latest news anytime, and as a place to find current and former copies of this show. Thanks to Dr. Russell Minyagi for joining us this morning to share some interesting facts from UP history. And thank you for tuning in. Thanks for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you again next Sunday morning.